Conversation Cross Question with Iain Dale.
Hello, a very good evening. It's 2 minutes past 8 on LBC. Welcome to Monday's Cross Question. If you're watching on Global Player, you will see some unfamiliar surroundings. We're back in the mothership in Leicester Square for this week on Cross Question, not where we normally are, but it won't affect the quality of discussion that you're about to enjoy over the next hour. With us in the studio, we have Paul Scully, former Conservative MP and Minister. Leonie Cooper, Labour member of the London Assembly for Merton and Wandsworth. She's Labour's environment spokesman at City Hall. Annabel Denham is acting comment editor at the Daily Telegraph, and Roger Mosey is Master of Selwyn College, Cambridge, and former Editorial Director of the BBC. Lots of time for questions. 0345 6060 973. You can WhatsApp us on that number. You can text 84850, and of course you can watch us on Global Player.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Well, let's go to our first caller. It's Robbie in Chelmsford. Hi, Robbie.
Good evening, Ian. Good evening, panel. My question is this. We sold off British steelmaking. 70% of our rail and train companies are currently foreign-owned. England and Wales are the only countries in the world to have sold off their water and sewerage systems to private interests. Should we renationalise key industries to lift Britain out of the bargain basement?
Paul Scully.
Hi, Robbie. Obviously important question at the moment. My answer is no in terms of a blanket nationalisation. I think we're inevitably going to have to take steel back into nationalisation for a while, because if you look at the last time we were trying to find a buyer, we only had one, Jingyi, and if you figure that they are now seemingly bad actors, according to what the government is telling us.
Were you a business minister when they took it over?
No, that was before my time. Right. I think Andrea Leadsom was the Secretary of State at the time. I was there when Alok Sharma and Kwasi Kwarteng was during COVID years. My time. But I think when you look at privatisations, it's been a mixed bag. If you look at British Telecom, I think that was a success. If you look at the investment that we've had into a lot of these industries that private sector have been able to draw in, that's been a good thing. But on the other hand, there have been less successful, water obviously being one of them.
Well, even the ones that Robbie says there, whether it's water or the railways, if they hadn't been in the private sector, they wouldn't have attracted the investment that they did, certainly in the initial years.
It's the way that they were privatised. I think that was the incorrect way, rather than the fact that they were privatised. I used to commute all the time with British Rail. And if you look at railways, we all moan about railways. I do now. I'm South West Rail user. I used to be with Southern. And you always get people moaning. But the amount of passengers these train operators carry is vastly increased through compared to the 90s. But it was always this relationship between the track and the rail operating companies. In terms of rail, in terms of water, you've effectively got institutionalised regional monopolies, and so it didn't instill that competition that privatisations like British Telecom did.
And I think it also depends on which line you take. I mean, the one I go home on, South Eastern trains, I have a very high opinion of them, because although of course tonight they're going to let me down having said that. Leonie Cooper.
I think it's very tempting to say nationalise everything. I think actually in some ways the problems that we've got, for example with water, having covered railways, I'm not sure that would be the answer, to try and go through something that would probably take quite a lot of time to unravel where we are. I'm not at all happy, and I have spent a lot of time as one of the leads on environment in City Hall, as you can imagine, talking to, yes, our favourites, Thames Water, who are in the worst state.
Is that a productive conversation, Leonie?
Well, it's we've had private conversations that have been quite difficult. We've also had public conversations, and so far they have not really been stepping up. but they have stopped paying dividends to shareholders since 2017. And I do think they've still got a long way further to go in terms of sorting themselves out. But of course, now we know that a lot of these companies have got our pensions invested in them. So I think it's easy to say, let's nationalise. I think the approach that the government is taking at the moment, both with British Steel and with the water companies, is a step forward. But if it doesn't work, then I think we will have to consider it. I think it's easy for Nigel Farage, who's not in government, to say, wave a magic wand, because he says that about pretty much everything.
I think it's interesting what you said about renationalising the water industry, because you're right, pension funds have huge investments in these industries. And I think there's a great difference here between British Steel and the water industry. I mean, British Steel is, it's clearly a hugely loss-making sector, and there would be no compensation. Whereas in the water industry, you couldn't do it without compensation because the entire pensions industry would probably collapse alongside it.
Yeah, so you have to be very careful.
Roger Mosey.
Well, we're saying that globalisation is over.
Well, Keir Starmer is.
Well, yes, that's now the official line. And therefore, national security, where the questioner came from in the first place, is obviously a worry. And the amount of UK infrastructure held by foreign companies, and especially the influence of the Chinese on steel, is clearly a problem. One of the things I find interesting is that nationalisation is actually one of those policies that is quite popular when you look at the polls. And certainly with water, I mean, you're right, absolutely, that there are complications about compensation and pension funds and all the rest of it. But when nationalisation was seen as being a far-left Jeremy Corbyn type policy, actually people quite liked it. They thought that nationalising the real essential services in the United Kingdom was probably a good idea. So I'm sure that's why Nigel Farage is on it, because he thinks it's going to be popular.
Do you think it's partly grass is greener on the other side sort of thing as well? Because I always have this instinct that I don't want to give government the ability to run anything, frankly, because I don't think when they do run stuff, they do it particularly well.
So former government minister.
Well, no, absolutely. I try to actually have a strategic view, but not run stuff.
That's completely right. I remember a politician saying to me once, would you rather air traffic control be run by civil servants or by someone like Marks and Spencer? Another time you think, well, that was before Marks and Spencer had their slightly wobbly period. You think, well, actually, there is an argument for privatisation. And obviously in the 1980s with Thatcher, privatisation was immensely popular. I just think it's swung back now and people are now worried about foreign control of the infrastructure.
Annabel.
I don't dispute your caller Robbie's premise. For years, the UK has been flogging its critical industries to the highest overseas bidder in some mad, crazed national car boot sale. And it seems that only now are we suddenly waking up to the risks associated with selling off vital infrastructure to dispassionate foreign buyers. But where I do disagree is this idea that we have a binary choice between the situation that we're currently in and total nationalisation. Let's not forget that steel has been nationalised twice since the Second World War, and that has not halted its long-run decline. And what we saw was that it was poorly managed, that they had regular problems with the unions and with so many other calls on the public purse. And this is a problem with nationalisation across the board. It meant that there was never really the sustained investment that was needed for comprehensive modernisation of steel. So no, I don't think that we should be looking to nationalise other sectors of our economy. We have a nationalised healthcare system, one which we're set to spend £200 billion on this year, with really very poor outcomes compared to other developed countries.
Jill says Paul Scully is only 56. Jill has been stalking you, Paul.
She has 2 weeks to ask me in 2 weeks' time. I'll be 57.
She continues, he can't know much about British Rail. It was okay, says Jill. Well, I'm 62 and I remember British Rail very, very well, and it was appalling.
There were two trains an hour from Sutton.
She says, of course, there are more passengers now. The population has grown too. Yeah, but if you actually look at the growth in rail passengers compared to the population, it is a massive upward curve for the number of rail passengers. Now, I'm not saying that is entirely due to privatisation, but it surely got something to do with it, because in the 1990s, and in fact quite well into the 2000s, on many lines, you had railway carriages that were built in the 1940s. Yeah. And that's one thing that privatisation, I think, hope we can all agree, it did bring the investment in for new rolling stock, and that makes it a more pleasurable journey if you're on a new train. Leonie, you're slightly shaking your head
Well,
there.
I am, because I think the point that Annabel just made about the binary choice is quite important here, because if you look at the biggest successful railway that's recently opened, the Elizabeth line, which, if anyone who's listening has not yet travelled on it, go and travel on it.
Broke down when I went on it.
Oh, I'm so sorry. But, I mean, it is actually
Great trains, though.
really lovely trains, amazing carriages, and huge numbers of passengers. So, and that's not in the private sector. And a lot of London's transport is in the public sector. So I don't think it is a binary choice. I think it's just about getting a good quality management system running these services, rather than necessarily saying everything must be nationalised.
TfL actually has an interesting hybrid model, because it's public sector, but it's contracted out. So they are still direct managers. Because you talk about, I'm amazed if people haven't travelled on the Elizabeth line, because I think it's one in every five journeys in the entire country on rail is on the Elizabeth line. So it shows the success that you
can't be true.
Absolutely is. Because if you think about how many people are travelling in London compared to the rest of the country in terms of just rail numbers, no, that's absolutely true. It was 1 in 6. I think it's coming down to 1 in 5.
Wow. Well, that is quite an achievement. Right, we will go to a break slightly early and we'll come back. Oh, in fact, let's not go to break slightly early. Let's hear Robbie's solution. Robbie, now, you regular callers to the programme. We know your political journey has gone from Conservative to Lib Dem to Reform, is it? Where are you now?
Careful. I'm a Lib Dem member.
You're a Lib Dem member now, are you?
Yes,
okay.
but had leanings towards the working class populism of reform.
Right.
Believe it or not.
So, what's your solution for this?
My solution. So, I actually, for those years, I often disagree with Annabel, but I think she nailed it a bit in the sense that there's a hybrid solution here, and not solutionised fully on air. What I think is, and I'm not the most patriotic person in the world, but it should be on our country's balance sheet, particularly things like water. Fair enough. Pay top dollar to get the right people in private industry to manage and operate, the cash flows and everything and the operations to make sure it works well. But it just should fundamentally be to be a proper country, to be able to own your own waterways, make your own steel for ships and all these strategic things we hear about now in this dangerous world, and manage your own transport infrastructure so you can be strategic about it. I mean, that just feels obvious to me.
Isn't another solution to... I mean, I don't think you should be dogmatic about privatisation or nationalisation, but if you do privatise an industry, you need to regulate it properly. And that's the problem with water and energy. I don't think that the regulators have been up to scratch.
I think that's fair enough.
Oh, awful.
Yeah.
Absolutely dreadful. And they never regulated what happened from 1989 onwards, so in the 90s and the early noughties, what the water companies were doing in terms of, we've ended up with Thames Water loaded up with 19 billion quid's worth of debt, and it's a bit like the Glazers and Manchester United, isn't it?
I mean, it's an Australian company, Macquarie.
It was Macquarie that did it.
I mean, if Macquarie hadn't bought Thames Water, I doubt we'd even been having this conversation. But you never know.
And where I do have sympathy with Robbie's argument is with the Labour Party getting rid of NHS England, for example. I think that's indicative of the fact that politicians stand up time and time again. We get it in the neck, I used to get in the neck, for the railways, for water, but there was nothing we could do about it because it was always someone else's fault, and we were trying to paddle furiously under the water.
It's okay, we're going to have a bonfire of the Quangos, which is yet another government going to have a bonfire of the Quangos. I think you're right, the regulators are terrible. The question is, if you don't have the regulators, what do you have?
Better ones.
Well, I think you should have more accountability on the politicians themselves. It's absurd to be in a situation where they're able to outsource decision-making about really important issues to arm's-length bodies. And what that does is leads us to a situation where the responsibility is with unelected bureaucrats, but it's politicians who are always taking the flak and the criticism for decisions that they may not themselves be making.
I think that's right, though if you think about the number of ministers there were at various times in various departments over the last few years, the idea you'd get continuity and necessarily excellent management, that's also for the birds.
Final word to Joseph in North London, who says, British Rail was great. I travelled to Bolton aged 15 and I had a chicken salad and half a bottle of Liebfraumilch. Happy days. Does that still exist, Lee Fromer? It was a big thing back in the 70s, wasn't it? I'll leave that question hanging. 0345 6060973 if you'd like to put a question to our panel. You're listening to LBC at 17 minutes past 8.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale. Watch live on Global Player. This is LBC.
It's 18 minutes past 8 on LBC. We have with us in the studio Paul Scully, former Conservative MP and Minister, Roger Mosey, who's Master of Selwyn College, Cambridge, Annabel Denham, Acting Comment Editor at the Daily Telegraph, and Leonie Cooper, Labour Member of the London Assembly and their Environment Spokesperson. Right, John is in Hammersmith. John, very good evening to you. What would you like to ask our panel?
Evening. Given that the Chinese Communist Party is or appears to be actively engaged in acts of sabotage, ranging from Scunthorpe through the cutting of cables in the Baltic Sea and off Taiwan and various other things, cyber attacks, should Britain, the United Kingdom, follow the United States' lead and enact tariffs against Chinese goods coming into the country?
Annabel.
No, I don't believe that they should. I think we need to bear in mind that the benefits of trade come as much from imports as they do from exports. And this is one of the great misunderstandings Donald Trump seems to have. When we import goods and services, then we increase choice and competition, and that's beneficial to consumer, as is the fact that it often brings down prices. So I think that in this tariff war, we do need to resist the temptation to impose reciprocal additional tariffs on other countries. There are things that we need to do with China, but I don't think that tariffs would be the right approach.
Roger?
I agree, tariffs are the wrong answer. I think on China, it seems to me inevitable we are going to have to work with China in some way. China is going to be the dominant power in the world if America moves aside on that. And I worked in Beijing for the Olympics in 2008. And at that time, I think China was more open. I found it an incredibly interesting, lively, actually disputatious country, and one that was at that point trying to open itself up more to the world. Now, since then, it's gone backwards, it seems, and Xi has become a more dictatorial leader of China. But you always have to hope that China will engage with the rest of the world in a positive way, which is what various politicians over the years have tried to make happen. And if it does, that's going to be for the benefit both of China and the United Kingdom. So I think we have to keep working on that.
So realpolitik has to prevail.
I think it does. I mean, how do you shut China out of everything? How do you expel it from every investment it's made in the United Kingdom? You can't do that. So we have the particularly acute issue of Scunthorpe,
but there's a
and you
difference,
have to act toughly on that.
Because you can either positively welcome Chinese investment in our infrastructure, which Cameron and Osborne did, or you can be very sceptical and say, well, actually, given what's happened with British Steel, given what's happened in all sorts of other areas, we don't want it anymore.
Well, in challenging my ambiguity there, Ian, you're absolutely right. But that, of course, is exactly what the British government has done for the last 20 years. And we've been getting a closer relationship with China and then being tougher with them. Seems to me the being incredibly hard on what they're doing in Scunthorpe, which, as John says, looks like industrial sabotage. Of course, you've got to clamp down on that, be tough on it. Do you need a wider engagement with China in the long term?
But
Yes, you do.
That's after the event, though, isn't it? Surely we've got to anticipate this sort of thing. And given that we know what China is doing, I mean, cutting cables, cyber attacks and all the rest of it, why on earth would we welcome more Chinese investment?
Well, that's the alternative view, which is if you anticipate it, you shut them out completely. If you shut them out completely, it probably damages Britain more than it damages China. And you've got to look at a world in which China is a superpower.
Leonie?
I think the issue for us is that China has been changing, and I think it's changed a lot under President Xi from where it was even at the point when we handed Hong Kong back, which actually isn't really that long ago. And I don't think it's the same country that we were talking about then. So we need to, I think, keep a very close eye on exactly what it's, because if we think it's doing things here in terms of sabotage close to home, what's been going on in the South China Sea is even more extreme. And if you live in Taiwan and you're next to a big neighbour, that's actually really very difficult, I would think, for the Taiwanese. And so I think looking, it's a historical set of circumstances, I think, and as they're moving into the future and they're starting to have a much bigger sense of their role as the global superpower, which in one sense, what Donald Trump is doing is helping. It's actually making their relationship with so many countries around the world, and they've been investing not just in the UK, they've been investing all over Africa and in a lot of other places. So I think we need to be looking at them very carefully, very, very carefully. And I do think we need to think about critical infrastructure and whether we do want Chinese investment in it and also involvement in things like our, here we are, we're on the radio, we're broadcasting and all of those things. I think that is, for me, I do have a concern there, I do.
Paul?
Yeah, I agree with the sentiment that we've got to be really careful with our relationship with China. It's almost supping with the long spoon in that regard because of security issues. When I was tech minister, we had our semiconductor strategy, which obviously is heavily dependent on Taiwan. Effectively, if Taiwan gets invaded, we're pretty well in global recession territory there because of the amount of semiconductors that are made
But we've known this for
in
years,
Taiwan.
so why don't we do anything about it?
What, in terms of defending Taiwan or what?
Getting semiconductors from elsewhere?
Because that's exactly what the strategy was all about. Because we don't manufacture enough here. We're not going to be a new Taiwan here. We do have amazing clusters of semiconductor fabs in South Wales, in the northeast, and in Northamptonshire. There's some as well. And we do design really well. So what we're doing, we're leveraging our design work of these chips with the manufacturing in America, in Japan, in Korea, and places like that.
Why can't we make?
There is no one country, even America. There is no one country that's going to be able to produce the demand for semiconductors alone. A Tesla car has 3,500 separate semiconductors in it. So if you think about the tens that you have in your phone,
they won't be needed soon.
Well, exactly. but either way, but tariffs are not the answer for this. I think at the end of the day, who pays for the tariffs? It's the customer. And so all we're doing with China being the biggest exporter in the world, we're just loading a load of costs on us. And I think Leonie was right. What Donald Trump is doing actually is giving China a bit of a push to their ends, actually, for the work that they've done in terms of investing in other countries, especially around Africa, as you say, in deep sea ports and the like, in Sri Lanka and even in the Caribbean.
Right, let's move on. John, thank you for that. Let's go to Kyle in Solihull. Hello, Kyle. Oh, no, it's a text question. Who are your sympathies with in the Birmingham bin dispute? Now, Unite members have today overwhelmingly rejected a deal to end the strike, with the union describing the offer as inadequate. Roger Mosey.
My sympathies are entirely with the people of Birmingham and the fact they've got all their rubbish piling up. I do think this is obviously one of the challenges of a Labour government. Labour governments are born out of the union movement. And when they come to a dispute like this, it's very, very hard, it seems, for them to settle it. I don't have any great sympathy with Unite, who seem to be holding the people of Birmingham hostage. And I hope
But their members are getting an £8,000 pay cut, according to them.
Well, that's disputed. I mean, that is disputed. And I think that you have to recognise, the unions have to recognise that Birmingham is in an extraordinary position of having gone bankrupt as a council. It's got this huge bill for equal pay going back over the years, and somehow it has to make its public services work. And that's where you hope the unions are going to be constructive in working with them, rather than leaving people with mounds of rubbish and rats.
Leonie.
Well, obviously for the people of Birmingham, because this is a hideous situation where they're caught between a rock and a hard place. But I think it's symptomatic of some of the problems for local government finance. I think the council that's got the biggest, are we allowed to mention black holes? I think we hear slightly too much about them, but is Woking, who made some very unwise investments and now are £2 billion in terms of a black hole. And they're just one small local authority. Birmingham is in a really difficult place. And Unite at the moment, I can understand if people are being asked to take an £8,000 pay cut. It would be very difficult for most people to put up with that. But I think it's the people of Birmingham amongst the rubbish who, surely that's where all of our sympathies are.
Well, that may be so, but I think what lies behind the question is, are your sympathies with the Unite members or the local authority? And obviously there are many local authorities in perilous financial situations. But in the end, how's this going to be solved? Is it something that the national government needs to get involved in?
I think if it isn't solved soon, then yes. I mean, we've been hearing that the army are going to be involved in helping with the logistics of trying to get the rubbish.
3 people so far.
Yeah, so that's clearly not enough, considering there are mountains of rubbish now all over the streets of Birmingham. And if Unite and Birmingham are not able to sort it out between them, we're getting to the point where, yes, I think national government would have to become involved in that. I can't see how they could not. I mean, it's just complete. I mean, Birmingham's a massive city, and this is insupportable, surely. And it's been pretty hot weather in the last few weeks. It's not nice at all.
Rats the size of zebras, apparently.
Well, I've seen those in, not zebras, but I've seen them the size of cats in Wandsworth Prison. They are absolutely enormous there as well. So you can find very large...
What had you done to get into Wandsworth Prison?
I was on a visit. I'd been invited.
I just thought I should clarify that.
It's in your constituency.
This
is part of Leonie's rehabilitation to come on this programme.
That's right. No, it's a prison only for men, and it's in my constituency.
I can see the tag from here.
No, shush, no. You're not. Shouldn't be looking at people's ankles. That's rude.
Quite. God, what have I started, Paul?
It's difficult. Well, actually, Leonie's right in terms of the government needs to lean in at some point, because the commissioners are actually in Birmingham. They've been appointed by national government, by Angela Rayner's team. So there is a national element in there anyway. And crikey, what a contrast. Birmingham was always seen as one of those cities that was amazingly run in back in the days of Joseph Chamberlain and all these kind of things.
You are going back.
Well, before my 56 years. But it's difficult to work out what the truth is in terms of the dispute, because as Roger said, it's disputed, the figures. I think it's about Unite are saying there's about 150 staff that's going to cost them £8,000 a year. The council are saying it's 17 staff and it's £6,000 a year, and there's a redundancy freeze on it. It's difficult for us from the outside working out exactly what it is. But I do know that my understanding as well is that there were 3 sites that were involved, 2 of which had originally agreed to what the council was coming up with. It's when the 3rd site came in that United the Union came in, and it got political very quickly.
And Annabel?
My sympathies, as with the rest of the panel, are entirely with the people of Birmingham, who must be in a state of despair at what's happened to their city, Britain's second city, home to such beautiful architecture, and which once had more canals than Venice, as we're often told. But in terms of this dispute between the union and Birmingham City Council, the council must win. Part of its financial difficulties, as Roger has said, result from this equal pay claim. And if they agree to increase the pay of these these bin collectors, they're going to tee themselves up for another similar equal pay claim in the future. And unfortunately, in this instance, there really isn't any comparable work which is conducted by women where there might be a reasonable claim, but I don't think that will stop them.
OK, we have half an hour for more questions on Cross Question. 0345 6060 973. It's 8:31 news headlines with Amelia Cox.
Bin collectors in Birmingham have voted to continue strikes after rejecting what they called a totally inadequate offer from the City Council. The Army's now helping to tackle the rubbish piling up on the streets as the walkout enters its 5th week. The government's confident it will secure the supply of materials needed to keep blast furnaces at British Steel's Scunthorpe plant. Ministers have taken over the site after emergency legislation was passed at the weekend. And 15 people, including a former Tory MP and current member of the Senate, had been charged over bets placed on the timing of last year's election. The Conservatives say any staff members facing charges have been suspended with immediate effect. LBC weather: cloudy with outbreaks of rain for much of the UK tonight. Drier for Northern Ireland and the far west of Scotland with just the odd shower and a low of 1 degree.
This is LBC. Leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale. Alexa, send a comment to LBC.
8:34 on LBC. Leonie Cooper is with us, Labour member of the London Assembly. Annabel Denham, acting comment editor at the Daily Telegraph. Roger Mosey, who is Master of Selborne College, Cambridge. What does that actually involve? It sounds terribly grand.
Oh, well, it involves representing the college, talking to students, running the governing body, but you know, it's a fabulous job to do. I really believe in the education we do there.
But it's coming to an end.
It is, yeah. I know. I'm back on the market, so.
Well, that was kind of what I was hinting at. So, anybody that wants a former master of Selborne College, but I mean, your media experience is legendary, isn't it? I mean, whenever there's a story about the media, you're one of the first people that we and loads of other people want to ring up because you've been round the block in television and radio news, haven't you?
Well, it's one of the things about the BBC being a gift that keeps on giving in terms of commentary, because the BBC is never quiet, and I worked in news and sport, and those are the two things which tend to get the headlines.
And Paul Scully is here, former Conservative MP and Minister. I always want to sort of introduce you as recovering MP.
I'm so recovered, it's
so
unbelievable.
You are very well recovered, aren't you? You've well adjusted, because a lot of people who either stand down or are defeated don't adjust very well.
Yeah,
and you're not one of them.
No, I've really loved it. I mean, I did take the decision before, quite some time before, and I was getting slightly more cynical, shall we say, about politics in general. No, I'm enjoying being back to business. But this is my fix. This is my political fix. I can talk about politicians rather than being one.
Right, let's have a WhatsApp question from Lance, who says, if this Chinese super embassy in London gets built and Hong Kong and Taiwanese and Chinese dissidents in the UK start getting harassed or worse, harmed, what would the UK's response be? Are we forgetting the lesson from the Salisbury poisoning? That was Russia, not China, by the way. Leonie.
Well, we've talked about this actually in the Assembly, and we're not terribly keen on the idea of what was the Royal Mint becoming the Chinese embassy.
Why not?
We just think it's wrong. We think it's in the wrong place. We think it's not a good idea. It comes back to the point I was making about we need to consider very carefully how much we involve Russia in our infrastructure and
China.
Yeah. Sorry, you've got me saying Russia now, as you said, the Skripal.
But if it was that Germany wanted to put an embassy here, we wouldn't mind, would we?
I'm still not sure I'd want to use the Royal Mint for anybody's embassy. I actually think it's a really interesting building that has heritage attached to it, and I'm not sure that making it, because an embassy becomes part of a foreign country, and I'm not sure that it's an appropriate building for that myself.
And what's happened to the Royal Mint? Where's it gone?
I'm not sure we're minting that many coins anymore.
That's true.
So I'm not sure we're using much money anymore. I mean, the level of bank closures as a result of the fact that we don't go into bank branches anymore is quite astonishing. I mean, they're all forming bank hubs now where they can, if you want to bank, you can go to one place and there'll be 27 different banks there available for you. So it's a huge set of changes.
Annabel.
I'm afraid in answer to the question, I don't think that the Labour government will do anything at all. Unfortunately, they seem to be committed to retaining our reasonably close ties with the Chinese government, and doing so and hailing a golden era with China in the 2010s, as Cameron and Osborne did, I think was naive. But I think to do so now is extremely foolish, if not dangerous. We do need to be finding ways of decoupling from China rather than allowing them to have more control over our critical industries or have more of a presence here in Britain, particularly when their behaviour and their antagonism is becoming increasingly overt.
Paul?
Yeah, I talked earlier on about supping with the long spoon with China. I think if you've got open trade of import of export of goods, that's one thing. But as we've discussed, if you're looking at our national core infrastructure and national heritage sites, as Leonie said, and obviously the general security and the politics around it, then that is a very different thing. And we've got to be incredibly careful how we deal with that. I think that is very difficult, but we've got a great intelligence services, and I think they've got to feed into government at the highest level to make sure that actually people, the Labour government, do understand the depth of the issues there. It's difficult for us to sort of like see from the outside in some ways.
Should we not think of it in this way, that if the British government put in to build a new embassy in Beijing of a similar size, on the edge of the main business district of Beijing, do we think that the Chinese government would actually countenance it at all?
I'm not sure why. Well, absolutely not. Of course they wouldn't. And that would be true of many countries. And you have to ask yourself, why are China looking at having a sort of supersized embassy in the City of London? They won't build it for the fun of it. There must be a purpose for it, whether that's to work around the rest of Europe or some other area. I'm not sure what that purpose is.
I would argue, Ian, that politicians are so desperate for cash, regardless of the source, because they raise taxes and they increase government spending and they borrow and they rack up massive debts, and yet they still seem to not have enough money to perform their most basic services to the British public, and therefore they scratch around for alternative sources. And that's how we find ourselves in this position where everything is very short term. It's just a case of trying to find the investment required for the next project or next round of funding for government departments, and that's how we found ourselves in this position.
But in a dangerous world in which we have both the hostile states and also hostile groups, which still exist and are still hugely problematic, I'm just not sure that the positioning of an embassy is really the biggest security concern. I mean, if we put it in Milton Keynes, is that better?
Well, it is if you have cables running underneath
where it's at.
controlling the communications of the City of London.
But
Given we know that China is, should we say, prone to cut cables under the North Sea or the South China Seas.
It's all
it'd
accidental.
be pretty obvious,
obviously.
wouldn't it? If the cables under London were cut and they're right next to the Chinese embassy, you might have a pretty... Look, I think there are serious security concerns about all these issues. I don't want to make light of them. I just think the positioning of an embassy, and, we've now got the American embassy down in Nine Elms.
Donald Trump called that an off location. How dare you?
Well, he's going to move back again, I presume. I don't know.
I don't think he can.
The positioning of the embassy doesn't seem to be the prime concern. The big concern is just how dangerous the world now is and how there are so many hostile players.
Maybe we should move the American embassy to Royal Mint and let the Chinese have the American embassy. There's a thought.
It was built new, and it's actually interesting architecture. And what Donald Trump clearly didn't understand was actually, if you travel from the Battersea site, where the new US embassy is, to the Houses of Parliament, it's a much faster journey than trying to get there from Grosvenor Square.
Yeah, we can do it on the river.
We can do it on the river, apart from anything else.
Well, of course, the hotel, because you've got Battersea Heliport nearby, and so there's often, when I was in Parliament, you'd often get the American helicopters coming over from Winfield House over towards the embassy that way.
Even faster than going on the river.
Absolutely, there you go.
I used to go to work on the river. I regarded that as one of the more decadent periods of my life.
The joy of London.
Absolutely. Right, let's go to Chris in Stubbington. Hello, Chris.
Hello, Ian. Should President Trump visit Ukraine before a deal is struck with Russia and stop blaming Zelensky for starting the war?
Well, President Zelensky has urged Donald Trump to visit Ukraine so he can see the devastation for himself. Trump himself has made some pretty disgusting comments, I think, today about Ukraine and Zelensky. Paul, let's start with you.
I've missed what he said today, but I think Donald Trump has a record for dodging war conflict areas, hasn't he, when he dodged the draft some years ago. But he should go to Ukraine. Absolutely. Of course he should go to Ukraine because, as you say, I haven't heard today, but what he's been saying in the past is just dismissing any of Zelensky's concerns, dismissing Europeans' concerns, importantly dismissing the people of Ukrainians' concerns, all seemingly to get close to Vladimir Putin and just repeating all of Vladimir Putin's talking points.
Leonie?
It is the most bizarre thing that he keeps repeating this nonsense, I can't think of a better word, that somehow Ukraine started the war, which is what seems
and it was
to have
also
come
about the mistake in the attack. He described it as a mistake in the attack. That's right. So yes.
I don't understand how he can possibly think that. The whole of the war is taking place in Ukraine, apart from a very small incursion into Kursk, which I think the Russians have now pretty much pushed them out of that particular oblast in Russia. I mean, he really should go there because it still seems a bit odd to me that he really doesn't seem to understand that it was Russia who started the war by invading Ukraine. And, we all saw the pictures on the television. Was he not watching at the time? They came through Belarus. They came, over the border out of Russia directly into Ukraine, and they're occupying parts of Ukraine. They started it. I mean, it's nonsense to suggest anything else. He should go there. He should meet some of the families who've lost loved ones. He should also meet some of the families who've had their children stolen.
Yeah.
The stolen children isn't really being talked about enough.
That's the untold story of this war, I think.
It is, absolutely. And they've estimated a number where people have had children stolen from families. But, of course, there are orphanages, so they don't really have the full number of children who've been stolen and have been taken off to Russia and given to Russian families. And I just think that's so sad. That's really sad.
Annabel.
Well, so much for the Nobel Peace Prize and Trump bringing an end to the Ukraine conflict in 24 hours. And then, of course, they moved the goalposts and it was Easter, and now that is being delayed. He promised that there would be a lasting peace in the Middle East. Well, he hasn't achieved that. And, of course, there were those talks with Iran over the weekend, and they seem to have achieved very little. All that Trump seems to have managed with Ukraine is humiliating Zelensky in the Oval Office alongside J.D. Vance, holding discussions directly directly with Putin, but shutting out Kyiv from any sorts of negotiations. And the view must be that they're going to attempt to foist some peace deal on the Ukrainian people, one which I suspect they won't be able to countenance. And this is, of course, Trump already having made several concessions to Putin, emboldening the Russian president enormously at a time when he's very weak. Domestically, look at the state of the Russian wartime economy and the fact that inflation has shot up to over 20%. Look at the sanctions which have been imposed on Russian oligarchs and the pressure that they are putting on Putin. But nevertheless, he seems to be siding with the ultra-nationalists. And who can really blame him if he doesn't consider America to be a serious threat, the world's policeman, and a country which is going to keep him in check? So, unfortunately, I do think that he should go to Ukraine. I do think that he should be showing support to the Ukrainian people and to President Zelensky, but such a thing looks very unlikely at this stage.
Roger.
Well, seeing the footage of the attacks on civilians yesterday, which I thought was devastating and heart-wrenching, of course Trump should go there. What seemed to me so dangerous about what he was saying today was it seemed to be an argument that small countries should never provoke big countries. Yeah. And of course, the whole point about all the geographical area around Russia is you've got the Baltic states and you've got other small countries. Is he going to say that they provoked a war if Russia invades there? So I think it's a horrible view of the world, which is just so depressing that the President of the United States can keep perpetuating these lies.
Just think how much Canada has been provoking the US as well.
Well, it would be good, I think, for Donald Trump to read the chapters in Boris Johnson's memoirs about Ukraine, because I've just gone through them. And I mean, a brilliant piece of writing, actually. And it's sort of, I can't really explain on the radio how important I think it is that people see from a British point of view what happened. And the chapter on Boris's first trip to Ukraine, where it's sort of very secretive, because I think it was only a couple of weeks after the invasion, and getting on this train in Poland and then travelling for 12 hours. It's a brilliant piece of writing, I have to say. All right, end of plug for Boris Johnson's memoirs, but it is a good book. 0345 6060 973 is the number to call if you'd like to ask our panel a question. It is 8:48.
LBC Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
8:51, Paul, Scully, Roger Mosey, Annabel, Denham and Leonie Cooper with us, taking your calls and texts and WhatsApp messages. Here's a text question from Barry in Shoebury Ness. Why are our prisons still like the Wild West? That's a very short question. Manchester Arena bombing plotter Hashem Abedi, whose brother carried out the terror attack which killed 22 people and injured hundreds more in 2017, attacked 3 prison officers with hot cooking oil before then attacking them with what has been described as homemade weapons at HMP Frankland in County Durham on Saturday. Leonie, having recently been to a prison.
Well, I was going to say, having been in Wandsworth recently, and one of the problems has been low numbers of staff and incredibly low staff morale. And so as you bring in new staff, you know, they're not used to working in that environment. And so it's extremely difficult for new staff. It takes some time to find your feet. And, of course, the number of staff compared to the number of inmates is tiny in comparison to the number of inmates. And we are in a very bad position because of the levels of overcrowding. A lot of people in prison obviously can't read or write, but there's also large numbers of people with mental health problems. As I was just saying, if you're having hallucinations, but at the same time there are massive rats, how do you know the difference between a hallucination and a massive rat? I mean, you know, it's really, really difficult in some of the prisons. So, you know, we've got a lot more that needs to be done to sort out the situation. And I think how Hashem Abedi was allowed to have... I mean, I thought it was always a privilege to be able to work in the kitchen, and I think that was a huge mistake. He'd already attacked people previously when he was in Belmarsh. So they do need to review, I think, who is being given what privileges, and people like him just can't be given any kind of privilege at all at any time, I'm afraid.
Paul?
It doesn't feel a complex problem. It just feels like a long list of things. Exactly as Leonie says, why are prisoners like that getting those sort of privileges?
You know, you've agreed with Leonie on every question.
I know.
You're going soft.
I am going soft.
You want us to have a fight?
But then it goes to you know, what is the purpose of prison? Because actually overcrowding is caused partly by the fact that we're not building enough prisons, which comes down to the planning reforms, but it's actually the fact that we're not looking at sentencing rationally, which is, as a Conservative, is, you know, very much tribally not something we tend to talk about. Rory Stewart did, David Gauke did, and that I don't feel I'm from their part of the party, if you like. But it just makes common sense that if you're putting people who would, you know, for short sentences in prison, you're effectively just giving them criminal finishing school in many ways, and you're not actually rehabilitating people. And it's how you bring people through a system, punishing them, having the deterrent, showing the public that they are, that they have been punished, but then finding a way of bringing them back to society and having that sort of conveyor belt, and then having the staff, as you rightly say, paying them a reasonable amount so that they can actually be totally independently minded, not subject to potential for bribery and being lent on by some prisoners.
I think you're absolutely right in that. If you look at what prison officers earn for the job that they do, I mean, I don't think any of us around this table would want to do that job for the salary that they get. Not. So it's not surprising that they find it difficult to recruit. Annabel?
Why do we have such problems in our prisons? Well, it's because of years of underfunding. The prison estate has seen chronic underinvestment over decades, really. And one of the problems is that I think successive governments and political parties have assumed that there are few votes to be had in penal reform. But actually, if you poll the public, they care deeply about criminal justice, about ensuring that those who commit crimes are put into prison and rehabilitated, and that we find a route for them to be integrated, if possible, back into British society. And because there hasn't been that investment, our prison estate is in an absolutely squalid, shameful condition. There are prisons in Britain today which really ought to be shut down, but instead they're overcrowded. We have a staffing retention crisis. We train people up to work in our prisons, but the conditions are so poor, so dangerous in some cases, that people, quite understandably, to be honest, leave. And what we need to have is a proper commitment from this Labour government that they're going to fix this problem, that they're going to build more prisons, that they're going to invest, that they're going to pay staff properly, competitively, and then that might begin to resolve the issue.
Roger.
I'm not going to disturb the consensus. I agree completely. A rational policy on crime and punishment is so desperately needed. And hearing some of the accounts about the gang culture in prison, which is incredibly worrying, and our prison officers have a right to be safe, and we owe it to them and to the people of this country to have a prison system which punishes people appropriately, but is also not overcrowded, is well run, and is properly funded.
Steve in Manchester says experienced UK prison office salaries can reach £40,000, the same as a Birmingham bin lorry driver, which probably puts it into perspective. Yeah. Right, a text question from Jane in Falkirk. SNP ministers in Scotland have just handed themselves a £20,000 pay rise. Are our politicians paid way too much, about right, or not enough? Now, the Scottish First Minister, John Swinney, has today partially lifted the ministerial salary freeze, which was introduced by the late Alex Salmond in 2009. Every minister in the Scottish Government will now see their annual salary rise by £19,126 from this month. Relatively short answers from you all, please. Annabel.
I think that we should be paying our politicians, our ministers, much more in Britain today. And I think it speaks to the lack of respect that we now have in this country towards politics, that when an MP tries to say this, when they dare to stick their head above the parapet, they are derided for being out of touch. What we need is to pay them more so that we can encourage the best people into these positions, pay them competitively, but perhaps there might be some mechanism through which their pay, as in the private sector, is linked to their performance.
Roger.
Yeah, there's a great cliche now about being paid more than the Prime Minister, which actually is because the Prime Minister is paid a very low amount of money for the job that he or she does. So I'm in favour of getting better people into politics, and if that means paying them more, so be it.
Leonie.
As the only person who is a paid politician on the panel, I find myself in a difficult place. I don't actually know what the base salary is of the ministers in the Scottish Parliament, so I don't know whether a £20,000 rise is a good thing or a bad thing, so I don't know where we're starting from. I think that MPs with a base salary of 90 is okay, but I do think once people pick up ministerial responsibilities, I think they are pretty much underpaid. If you look at, let's say, Thames Water, and even with poor performance, you can see very large salaries in comparison.
Well, cabinet ministers in Scotland get £116,000 and other ministers get £100,000, which is way more, I think I'm right in saying, Paul, than UK ministers.
Yeah, I used to have to shout down the chief executive of the post office, and I was paid about £20,000 as a minister. Obviously on top of my MP salary, clearly. But the first thing I had to do when I became a minister, every department I was in, was to sign the waiver form that was similar to Scotland. So waiving part of my salary that David Cameron had waived for me 5 years before I was even in Parliament because of the previous recession. And so I don't like this hair shirt thing when you're virtue signalling, because it's impossible to unwind, because otherwise you get headlines like this.
Now you're freed from the shackles of ministerial responsibility. What do you think should be an MP's salary or, say, a cabinet minister's salary?
Actually, I was almost paying them double, but make sure that you actually demand greater emotional intelligence and better strategic leadership from your MPs.
Right, our fun question from Susie in New Malden. Katy Perry went to space today. Well, she didn't quite, but she nearly got there, on one of Jeff Bezos' Blue Origin rockets. Which famous person would you most like to be locked inside a rocket ship with, and why? Annabel.
I thought you might come to me first, Iain. Thank you.
Did you? Oh.
Well, do you know what the first
Completely
person who sprang to mind? Well, I feared that you would. Perhaps it's a better way of putting it. Strangely, the first person who came to mind was Roger Federer, because I'm a keen tennis player, if not a particularly good one. And I just thought how wonderful it would be to have the man who I believe to have been the greatest tennis player of all time teach me how to serve properly. But unfortunately, I now realise that such a thing would be very difficult in the confines of a rocket capsule.
I could teach you how to serve properly, but then I'm 6'2", and that's the only bit I can do in tennis. So I often win against people who I can't play the rest of it.
The ball will be travelling slowly.
Can we set a date, Iain?
Believe me, you wouldn't want to. Roger?
But based on the vacuousness of what she said when she landed, I suppose it would be too much to hope she might continue into space for a few more days or even months. But I want Paul McCartney. He can write better songs, and as you floated around the earth, I think a McCartney tune would be better than a Katy Perry tune.
Goodness me. Leonie?
That's interesting, because I was thinking it would be great to go into space with a musician, but I was thinking of Jim Morrison from The Doors, who I also think is a great songwriter.
You're far too young.
Well, still a good songwriter, though, Ian. LA Woman, Light My Fire. Come on, there's thousands of them.
I'd have to be Elton John, the original Rocket Man.
Oh, very good, very good. Well, thank you all very much for coming in today. On tomorrow's panel, we have the former Reform UK Deputy Leader, Ben Habib, the former advisor to Sir Ian Duncan Smith, Charlotte Pickles, Christabel Cooper from the Labour Together think tank, and the political commentator, Matthew Stadlen. But coming up in the next hour, I want to turn our attention to electric vehicles, because plunging used electric car prices are costing fleet businesses hundreds of millions of pounds, according to the sector. I'm sure we're all getting onions out of our pockets for that one. But I think there is a wider question here, in that we're all supposed to be driving electric cars by 2030, but they haven't taken off as I think a lot of people thought they would. And a lot of people, me included, have bought an electric car and then sold it and then bought a diesel again. And this is not just me that's doing this. A lot of people are. Are we falling out of love with electric vehicles? And if so, why?
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation, this is LBC.
From Global's newsroom, bin strikes, which are now into their fifth week, will continue in Birmingham after workers rejected the council's pay offer. Unite the Union has described the deal as totally inadequate. Well, LBC reporter George Ike has been covering this story since bin collectors walked out last month.
The union said that the offer provided no protection